Our gospel lesson this morning is from Mark chapter 12, verses 38 through 44. Let us honor, I invite you as you're able to please stand, let us honor the reading of the gospel. As Jesus taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and he said to them, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury, for all of them have contributed out of their abundance. But she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. This morning I want to begin with just a brief question for you to ponder with maybe 2 or 3 people around you. If you don't know the people around you, please take a moment to introduce yourself. But today's gospel lesson focuses on giving and sort of a large gift versus a seemingly what we might call a paltry, insignificant gift, and yet in the eyes of Jesus it is a tremendous gift. So I want you to think about, has there ever been a gift that you have either given or received that at first to you maybe seemed a bit insignificant, but later on turned out to be a vital, important gift or a meaningful gift to you? So, all right, everybody got that? Has there ever been a gift you have either given or received that at first maybe seemed insignificant, but later turned out to be an important gift? So you have 90 seconds, and I invite you to go. Thirty seconds. All right, time is up. Let's come back together. And I'm going to invite in just a moment for you to share what your personal gift was that you either gave or received. And I'll start out by sharing this. In 1995, Heidi and I drove home from Rex Hospital with our firstborn child, our oldest daughter. We were both exhausted, Heidi more so than me. But her dad had driven up from Florida, and he had made for us this simple spaghetti casserole. I mean, with like canned spaghetti and a little bit of ground beef and onions and bell pepper and some spices. Put some cheese on top, throw it in the oven, and then he also made us just a simple lemon meringue pie, homemade lemon meringue pie. And after just, 2 days of hospital food and getting on the road and driving home, We were exhausted, we were hungry, and to me, that simple gift, in any other circumstance would be just very simple, almost insignificant, but boy, that casserole was delicious. It was comfort food. That lemon pie hit my soul, and it just was just wonderful. So just a simple gift that turned out to be just a wonderful gift in the end. What other gifts started out maybe as insignificant, but maybe turned into something very special? Yes? Yeah, so your grandmother gave you silver coins. Nice. My grandmother gave me socks. So, and I'm still wearing them today. No, just kidding. Any others? Yes, Roger? Hmm. Yeah. Yep, those basic life skills that are taught that at first don't seem fun to learn or don't seem very interesting, but turn out to be great gifts. All right, one more. Anybody else want to share one more? Thank you all for sharing that. Just want to us to be mindful of all kinds of gifts that come into our lives. As I begin this morning, I just want us to note that the lectionary readings are set years in advance. And I want to note just a mix of maybe coincidence and a bit of irony that on the Sunday, after one of the most contentious and most costly elections in recent memory, the lectionary assigns this gospel lesson from Mark 12, where Jesus rebukes religious leaders for clamoring after places of power and honor, and he declares that a poor widow's offering is much more valuable than the large offerings given by the fat cat donors. And that cuts all kinds of ways. We don't know her name. The only thing that we do know about her is her social status, her economic status, and we know how much she gave for the offering that day in the temple. So much for confidentiality, I guess. The widow has been extolled in countless stewardship sermons as an example of radical generosity. If you grew up in the church, usually every fall during the stewardship campaign, the preacher would trot this poor widow out up and down the aisle and say, look at her. Look at her. She is destitute, and yet in the midst of her poverty, she gave everything. And we, middle class, upper middle class Methodists, we can do better in our giving. We need to be like her. Now, I'm not going to do that to you this morning. That's kind of manipulative. I'm going to wait till the end of the year, see how we're doing on the budget. We may see her again. But this nameless widow has been the inspiration for all kinds of capital campaigns, for new facilities, buying church vans and church buses, sanctuary renovations, parking lot improvements. I would argue that in the history of the church, this woman is probably indirectly responsible for raising billions of dollars. At this point in Mark's Gospel, in Mark 12, Jesus has made his triumphant entry into Jerusalem, which means that he is getting closer and closer to a cross. And on his way to the cross, Jesus stops to give the religious leaders in the temple a piece of his mind. And he tells his followers, beware the scribes and the religious leaders. Do as they say, but don't do as they do. They are hypocrites, prancing around in their long flowing robes, saying these long Baptist prayers, acting all pious. They don't practice what they preach. Man, these are tough words for me to hear as a pastor, as a preacher. I mean, I spend part of my Sunday morning in a long flowing robe, praying somewhat long prayers. And even though I've been a pastor and spiritual leader for over 30 years, Jesus is right. Preachers, we don't always practice what we preach. This has not come as a surprise to my wife. Jesus accuses these scribes of stealing from widows who put their lives in the trust of these religious men. Now, some historians note that this may be an actual reference to a horrible practice that took place in that day and time, where the scribes, some of the scribes or religious leaders, would worm their way into the lives of these poor widows, and they would live off the inheritance. They would live off of some of the most vulnerable people in society. And then Jesus turns his attention to the temple treasury. He watches folks as they give their offering that day. He sees the rich and the powerful, the influential, open their wallets and give huge sums of money. But then he focuses and notices a widow who put in 2 copper coins. And the old King James Version calls them mites, equal to about a penny. It's the only money she has to her name. Jesus says that she has given all that she had to live on. And that Greek phrase there, the Greek word for to live on, is bios, where we get the word biology. She left her life in the temple, and then she walked out. Now, instead of just 2 copper pennies, this widow has nothing to support her except her belief, trust in God. I remember reading about one of our Methodist bishops talking to another pastor, and this is in the aftermath of the housing crisis, housing crash back in the 2008, 2009. And the pastor was telling this bishop about how there were about a dozen or so persons in his congregation who had lost everything or nearly lost everything. And the bishop said, wow, that's just awful. And the pastor said, yeah, it's been really hard, but now I've got them exactly where I want them. And the bishop said, what do you mean? He said, you know, the scripture has all these warnings to the rich about don't depend on your finances, don't depend on your wealth to carry you through life. You've got to depend on God. And now these people have been forced to really live into those scriptures. They've had to learn the hard way how to ask for things they've never had to ask for, some of the basic necessities of life. And it has been painful, but they've rediscovered their faith. They've rediscovered what radical trust in God is. And the church, they've had to wake up and to rally around these people and to share their resources and to give them hope. This is like the Acts 2 church. Oh, it's been awful. It's been a challenge. It's been terrible. But it's also been quite beautiful to see people get born again and rediscover what it truly means to be utterly dependent upon God. In light of Jesus noticing how this widow just throws her life literally into the temple offering, here's another question I want us to ponder this morning. Is Jesus praising her, or is he lamenting her? Is he commending her for giving her all, or is he lamenting her for living under the assumption that her gift is going to go to help in the cause of God? Her gift will go into a system that will eventually, at least according to Jesus, line the pockets of the religious elite. Here is someone who is vulnerable to scams, to being taken advantage of by others. Here is someone who should be benefiting from and supported by the temple system, and yet this is a system that is literally taking her life. So is Jesus commending her, praising her, or does his heart break for her? We Americans, we pride ourselves on our common sense values, having good common sense. We want common sense to govern our policies, especially our economics. We just had an election in which the economy was at the top of the list for most Americans. Collectively, we want a return to common sense. We want common sense to govern national spending. We want common sense to govern even our household spending. We're taught from an early age, be frugal, be realistic in your spending, don't overspend. This is a discipline we instill or try to instill in our children. As parents, Heidi and I, we try to instill this value, the understanding of what a dollar is. We want our children to make wise financial decisions, to always be prepared, put aside some money for a rainy day. Spend only on what you absolutely need. Don't go into credit card debt. Pay with cash only if you can. Don't just throw away your money. I read about a pastor who wanted to catch up with an old friend of his, as an elderly gentleman. He discovered, though, that his friend had been inexplicably placed in a care facility. And this came as a bit of a surprise to the pastor because, as far as he knew, his friend had always been in very good health. He was in his late 70s, early 80s, but he still had pretty good health for his age. And the only thing he could find out at first was that the man had been placed in a care facility because of the distressing state of his mind, which surprised the pastor even more. So he contacted the man's family, and he found out that his friend had been volunteering a few days a week at this soup kitchen. He had been going week after week. He had really gotten to know and became friends with the staff there and the volunteers and the people, the homeless people that the soup kitchen helped to serve. He became friends with them. And one day, this man, at the end of his shift, he sat down at the table, took out his checkbook, and wrote a check for $100,000 to the soup kitchen and gave it to him on the spot. No forethought, no sitting down with the family to discuss this. $100,000 was a huge chunk of his savings. And he handed it over to a soup kitchen. And of course, when his children heard about it, they thought, he's losing it. So they forced him to go into a care facility where he could get proper supervision. Today, Jesus notices a poor widow, and I think it's very telling that Jesus, not the disciples, but it's Jesus who notices this poor widow come into the temple that day. He sees her put in what's left of her life, and he declares her gift to be the most extravagant, the most faithful, the most generous gift, more so than all the huge donations that were paraded into the temple that day. I like how one of my favorite writers and preachers, Barbara Brown Taylor, she makes a comment on this story. She says, "Nowhere in this passage does Jesus seem to praise the widow for what she is doing. He simply calls his disciples over to notice her and to compare what she does with what everyone else is doing. And then he invites them to sit down and contemplate the disparity between abundance and poverty, between large sums and 2 copper coins, between apparent sacrifice and the real thing. He does not dismiss the gifts of the rich. He simply points out that the major characters are really minor givers, while the minor character, the poor widow, turns out to be the biggest donor of them all." I remember several years ago, one of my former churches, during a finance team meeting, one of the members said, "We need to update our donor plaque in the narthex." And I said, I was new to the church at that time, and I said, "Well, what's the donor plaque?" And she said, "Well, that's the plaque that has the names of the people from our church who give a certain amount. You have to give a minimum of $500 as a gift to the church to get your name on the plaque." And immediately, this nameless widow from Mark's gospel came into my mind. And I thought to myself, wow, even if we did know her name, she couldn't get it embossed on the donor plaque in the narthex because of her paltry pennies donation. And yet, Jesus noticed this and declared it to be an extravagant gift. Now, for years, Forbes published the names of the top wealthiest people in the world, names that we're probably familiar with: Zuckerberg, Musk, Gates, Buffett. Isn't it interesting that there's not a list of the world's poorest people that's ever published? I wonder if it's because we don't know their names, or is it we don't want to know their names? I wonder if Jesus noticed this at all. Well, hear me, this is not a story about how little we give to God, and therefore we should be pressured, we should feel a sense of shame, try harder, cut corners, pinch pennies, give more to the church. Rather, this is a story that points to the self-giving sacrifice of Jesus. It's a story about how much God has given to us, and therefore we should rejoice because God's great love for us in Jesus is the ground of our hope. Jesus shows us that the reign of God is displayed in this lowly widow, not in the lives of the moral religious elites, but in a woman who is on the lowest rung of society. The generosity of God is shown not in the large interest-only contributions, but in 2 copper coins worth about $1. It's a story about noticing, paying attention, and Jesus calling us to pay attention to the vulnerable in our midst. People in our peripheral vision, people we avoid by crossing to the other side of the street. That's really all that Jesus does. He notices. He notices someone whom everyone else doesn't seem to notice because they're too busy being pious, holy, righteous. He notices her giving everything she has to a system that is taking advantage of her. In the pages of Scripture, in the memory of God's people, there is this story of a poor widow, fragile, impoverished, on the margins, who in utter self-abandonment gives her all, gives her life, gives her life circumstances. It may have been that she left her life savings, left her life in the temple that day and walked out. It is all within the realm of probability that she died shortly after this. Jesus said she had given everything she had to live on. She had nothing else to live on after this. She literally gave herself away because she trusted in God to be her all. In her giving, the poor widow is kind of a sneak preview. The self-giving sacrifice we will see in Jesus, who would give his life as a sacrifice for the world just a few days later after this widow. Just a few days after the widow walked out of the temple, Jesus Christ, the new temple, the temple made of flesh, walked up a hill to give his life for the world. Just a couple of chapters, Jesus will lay down his life extravagantly, excessively, radically,